Introducing Nickelodeon. Children's programming that's fit for children. 13 hours of programming a day, 7 days a week, that will make them wonder, laugh, ponder, and think.
Launching on April Fool's Day of 1979, Nickelodeon is the first ever cable channel of its kind to be aimed at a younger audience. While there have been televised programs in the past that are geared towards children, there hasn't been a full channel dedicated to this flavor of programming up until this point. However, for its first 5 years of going live, Nickelodeon struggled to find an audience and due to hardly any of their shows reaching a monument amount of success. Canadian sketch comedy series You Can't Do That on Television might be the only exception, but it wasn't enough for the network's viewership to be kept consistently afloat. That was until around 1984 when MTV alumni Fred Siebert and Alan Goodman were tasked to give the First Kids Network a new coat of paint. Gone was the silver ball and rainbow letters, and what replaced it was a series of orange-shaped objects behind a balloon font. In addition, several studios were brought along to create a series of identification spots and promotional material as a way to expand this new visual reinvention. 6 months after the launch of this rebrand, Nick would finally gain the recognition it has always dreamed of to the point where, alongside the shows they were broadcasting, it became the most dominant cable network for kids. As Nickelodeon's popularity continues to grow bigger into the next decade and thanks to the release of their original live-action programming and then newly launched original cartoons that go by the name of Nicktoons, it wouldn't take long for its then parent company Viacom to express interest in expanding the channel on an international scale. And among these would be a version of Nickelodeon that I consider to be one of the most interesting pieces of cable TV history. In other words, it's a tale of how one of the earlier localizations of a popular children's network had a good start when it launched, but wouldn't be long for it to struggle for attention, even more so the moment new blood started entering the picture. And while it was the first of its kind to have the plug pulled, that didn't mean all hope was lost. What do I mean by this? There's only one way to find out. This is the story of Nickelodeon Germany. On the 11th of January, 1993, Variety published an article that talks about Nickelodeon's first step to localizing the brand worldwide, that being Nickelodeon UK, a joint venture between the original American branch of the network and British Sky Broadcasting, now known as Sky UK. Senior Vice President of Nick's Program Enterprises, Anne Sweeney, states that the initial plan here is for the First Kids Network to launch this new era across multiple markets throughout continents such as Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Nick UK will operate independently across the 3.5 million households in Britain that own Sky's cable packaging, with the heads of this localization being provided by a yet-to-be-appointed chief executive alongside a 6-person managing director board, with 3 that worked at British Sky Broadcasting and 3 that worked at MTV Networks respectively. Speaking of the latter, chairman of MTV Networks himself, Tom Freston, expressed hope that this first international branch of the children's cable network will be just as successful in the United Kingdom and beyond as it was with MTV. And then, on the 1st of September, 1993, Nickelodeon officially launched in the UK and Ireland, in the form of going out with a bang in fact, as randomly selected kids from Britain and the US get slimed around the same time the moment the clock struck 0, all the while located between Nick UK's headquarters and the then still operating Nickelodeon Studios at Universal Studios in Orlando. Dare I say, they spent their money well on introducing Nick to a whole new audience, and judging from what this localization of the brand had to offer after that monumental countdown, the general public seemed to agree. In addition, Nick Jr. would also share a room with this iteration of the network as the block would air its selection of programming around school hours, including the fondly remembered face segments, where the character would be dubbed over to fit with the nation's English, as provided by comedian and voice actor David Holt, who I'd best describe as the British equivalent to that of Tom Kenny.
Here's the face you make when someone scares you.
With the success of the first international branch of the First Kids Network, Nickelodeon's then parent company hoped that they could strike another bolt of lightning by heading over to another European nation, this time being Germany, home of Oktoberfest, Ludwig van Beethoven, the Brothers Grimm, and that black and white vampire dude that appeared on SpongeBob. As a way to make sure Nickelodeon would reach as much success in the country of Germany as it did in the UK and Ireland, Viacom would promise a profit of 170 million marks, or 100 million USD, from several directors as part of a joint venture between the film and television division of Ravensburger AG, with Viacom owning 90% of the station and the remaining 10% being given to Ravensburger. On July 5th, 1995, Nickelodeon Germany officially launched to the public eye for the very first time under the now-defunct DFS Copernicus satellite, with its headquarters located in the city of Düsseldorf, airing from 1 to 7 p.m. on weekdays and 8 in the morning to 1 p.m. on the weekends. This schedule would change a few months later, however, from 6 in the morning to 8 p.m. While it was marketed as the first children's station broadcast in Germany, that statement is far from the case, as that credit actually belongs to Super RTL, which launched 3 months prior on the 28th of April. More on them later. But with all that said, what does Nickelodeon Germany have to offer? From what I managed to gather through all the tape recordings that are available online, the programming on Nickelodeon Germany consists of a good mixture between German dubs of their original shows, acquired programming from several studios, as well as original material made exclusively for its localization, with the addition of airing dubs of Nick's original shorts during the commercial breaks. Among the programs made for Nickelodeon Germany include Alles Klar, advertised as a children's comedy show that featured interviews with several popular music acts of the time. Hier und Ihr, which showcases random kids talking about what they like to do in their day-to-day lives, and the Nick Live Club, a live show that lets viewers interact in a variety of methods, mostly through call-ins and fax machines. Among the hosts of Nick Live Club is Hugo the Troll, a character that originated from a Danish media franchise of the same name, who honestly doesn't look too far off from the wackiness Nick would often present themselves back in the 90s. It's important to note that Hugo wasn't the first live character Nickelodeon would feature in this type of programming, as Bert the Fish from the network's British localization predates this, albeit done with a more advanced method of bringing the character to life using computer-generated imagery, also known as CGINA.
I hate kids. I hate them. They smell of milk.
In addition are the German versions of Nick's pre-established programming, as in, it's just a version of the same source material that happens to have a different coat of paint, including Hilf mit, an expansion of The Big Help, Nick Verleihen, one of the first international iterations of the Kids' Choice Awards that lasted about 2 shows, one in 1996 and one in 1997, as well as a German version of Nick News, where, judging from the only clip I can find of this that's readily available on the interwebs, this version seems to be different from the source material it's branching off of in more ways than one. Let me explain. Now, regardless of what your general opinion on Nick News is as a whole, even if you didn't catch an airing of it on TV when it was active, believe me, I never heard of the show up until the early 2010s, but what made Nick News such an important piece of Nickelodeon's history is that it gave kids the opportunity to express their thoughts on current events. In addition, it had a golden rule of never talking down to the audience since it's a news program. In this clip from Nick Germany's version of Nick News, on the other hand, everything that was once part of the appeal of the source material it's adapting from gets immediately thrown out the window. Now, no offense to the people working at Nick Germany back then, as I'm positive a majority of the crew operating the network are some of the kindest people to be around, but if you want my first impression of a children's news program to be a cartoonishly nerdy looking woman sitting at a small desk with her left ankle tied to a large amount of rope, a toy microphone, and a labeled tin can of what I'm assuming looks like graham crackers, while moving around in a goofy manner as she explains the topic of sports, then you've completely lost me. In other words, everything that is showcased in a singular 2.5-minute clip straight up goes against the whole point of Nick News, which is ironic since we're talking about the same international feed of a children's cable network that managed to air their versions of the KCAs without stripping away any of the core elements that make Kids' Choice the way it is. How can they get that right, but not this? 'Tis only a mystery. Now, Normally, a typical cable channel like that of Nickelodeon would usually get their profits through a mixture of pleasing advertisers and customers paying their subscription fees from the cable or satellite companies that keep these networks afloat. But Nickelodeon Germany is a different breed, as they only receive financial gain through advertising. If Barbie and the Looney Tunes are able to pump enough blood through a channel's veins, what's the worst that can happen?
Well,
first off, children's channels in Germany are typically free to air, meaning they're allowed to air their programming without the need of letting their customers pay for the service. Which would be fine for a channel like Nickelodeon Germany, except advertising is the only form of revenue they heavily rely on. Like, there are other ways for free-to-air networks to make money, you know. You can't just rely on being sponsored by Nintendo forever. Plus, it was around this time where Nickelodeon started creating and selling more officially licensed products and services as a result of the channel's ever-growing popularity. Why can't they sell that kind of merchandise over there, especially for a project as ambitious as a localization of a pre-existing channel? Second, for anyone that isn't fluent in capitalism, commercial breaks for any cable network usually last about a total of 12 to 15 minutes in length, which gives enough space for companies to place promotional advertisements for their products in between programming at whatever their heart desires. Meanwhile, Nickelodeon Germany decided it would be a good idea to decrease that time to around 7 minutes, thus making the children's network come across as less flexible in its presentation compared to what its original US feed is more comfortable with. Lastly, most of what plays during the commercial breaks are usually promos for programs that are already airing on the channel, as well as the aforementioned German dubbed shorts, while adverts for other brands only make up a minimal fraction of that airtime. For every commercial for a toy or food tie-in that'll at least spark the interest of the kids watching into begging their parents to spend their cash on, they are more than likely to bump into a handful of promos for what the channel had to offer. To any advertiser that is interested in wanting to showcase their products on cable television between shows, Nick Germany feels like a big waste of money. Based on the articles I've read as part of my research for this particular topic, I'm not sure on whether or not I would personally describe the overall execution of the initial goals for Nickelodeon Germany as a mere afterthought, because there is a clear amount of effort put into its presentation without a doubt, even if there are some elements of the channel that I would have done differently. But I feel like they should have utilized the free-to-air aspect a little better by giving advertisers more room to breathe and sell actual merchandise just to spread some awareness on Nick's arrival to German cable outside of a commercial or two. It didn't help that by the time Kinderkanal, now known as Kika, launched in January of 1997, multiple German cable providers replaced a good chunk of channel slots that once belonged to Nickelodeon Germany with that of Kinderkanal, causing this international feed of Nick to lose a total of 115 million Deutschmarks, or 89 million US dollars, as a result, thus putting the channel that has been established in extreme jeopardy. If anything, this marks the first time anything affiliated with the Nickelodeon branding is on the brink of its way out, even more so than when the original American channel struggled to stay afloat before the 1984 rebrand, and that is saying a lot. So, what was the solution Viacom came up with to solve this issue, you may ask? Simple! Kill it off while it's bleeding dry! Early in February of 1998, German daily newspaper Die Welt published an article where liquidation was the topic of discussion during a meeting between the managers and internationals that have worked at Nickelodeon Germany, where they decided on when they will shut the service down months in advance. At first, the employees working at Nick's German feed weren't so sure if the information featured in the article is considered legitimate regarding what's been written down, and decided to move on in hopes it wouldn't go anywhere. That was until the 28th of May, where employee Patty Krotz was working in the office around 8 p.m., who from what he can recall started to feel tense and fearful on the inside around that time. In order to get to the bottom of what was going on, he called an anonymous source in hopes they'll give out an answer, only for the person to respond 5 minutes later with the following: "Go home. It's over." It was those very words spoken through the phone that have since shaped his life forever. All that hard work he did for Nickelodeon Germany since day one is officially over. A day later, letters were sent to employees that thanked them, alongside other Nick associates, for working hard on making Nickelodeon Germany the way it was throughout its 3-year lifespan. At least it was better than laying them all off on the spot. By the time the final episode of Nick Live Club broadcasted, the channel played a little montage of the amount of achievements Nickelodeon Germany made while thanking all of their viewers for sticking around, before officially closing its doors on the 31st of May, 1998 at 8 p.m. before switching to VH1's German feed, which would last until May 1st, 2001, when it was replaced by the short-lived MTV2 Pop. More on that later. We'll return to the story of Nickelodeon Germany after this. With the closure of Nickelodeon Germany, it makes one wonder what new home its original programming will reside in moving forward. That is where RTL Group SA, then known as CLT UFA, comes into the rescue, as it struck a deal with Viacom to air both past and future Nickelodeon originals through Super RTL, with an additional weekend morning block on the main RTL channel dedicated to airing Nicktoons. In other words, Super RTL has since owned the broadcasting rights to a majority of Nick's library. And since the channel gives more room for advertisers to breathe in between programming compared to that of Nickelodeon Germany's in the past, the higher-ups don't have to worry too much about being seen as not so flexible in its presentation. If anything, it's a much-needed step in the right direction, especially for a brand that was already increasing its success beyond its home country. And by the time Super RTL introduced a new block titled Telgo in 2001, it not only became the primary brand for the channel, but has also since been the new home for programming aimed towards children around the ages of 6 to 13, including programming from Nickelodeon. It is thanks to this deal between two companies from two separate nations that so many German kids got the chance to watch episodes of SpongeBob and Fairly OddParents alongside other kids across the world that are just getting a taste of Nickelodeon for the very first time. In fact, this might have sparked Viacom's interest into wanting to give a German version of the Nickelodeon channel another shot, and this time, they came prepared. Yes, even more so than when they originally unleashed the first kids network back in the 90s. On April 7, 2005, Mantel posted an article on DWDL about Nickelodeon returning to German cable for the first time in 7 years starting in September, which will replace the then operating MTV2 Pop, the second channel that took over Nickelodeon Germany's original spot, as confirmed by Managing Director of MTV Central and Emerging Markets, Catherine Mullman. In addition, this relaunch of the brand will be under the much simpler name, Nick. A change that I'm not quite sure on why that would be even necessary. I get changing a logo to make it look simpler and easier on the eyes, if done right that is, but changing a name for similar purposes? It just doesn't click well to me. But that's besides the point. What about Super RTL? Don't they own the rights to Nick's original programming over there? While that is the case, and still is, the article does point out that the rights aren't usually exclusive, meaning that Nick is free to air their original programming alongside Super RTL's airings of said programming. Nick Germany will also air dubs of original programming that is exclusive to the channel, such as Drake and Josh and Avatar, as well as launch a website months in advance that goes over more info regarding his comeback. To hype up the release of its return, Nick Germany played a series of promos that go over the programming that will air on this international feed of Nickelodeon, while also notifying viewers the amount of days left until it's officially back on German cable TV, accompanied with voiceover provided by Santiago Zeismer through his performance of SpongeBob.
Noch einen Tag, dann geht es los.
And then, on the 12th of September, just as the countdown timer reaches its final numbers, Nick Germany is officially back on the air.
Jetzt geht's los mit Nick.
This time with its headquarters being located in Berlin, with the addition of introducing a primetime programming block titled Nick Comedy, targeted towards people around the ages of 14 to 49 that airs during weeknights at 9:15 p.m. while airing around weekend nights an hour early up until 3 a.m. Who even watches sketch comedy on Nick Germany at 3 a.m.?
Oh, Kinder, 3 Uhr morgens.
This portion of the relaunch only lasted until June of 2006, barely a year after its establishment, before being replaced by Comedy Central Germany on January 14, 2007. While there have been some elements of this comeback like that of Nick Comedy that came and went throughout the channel's lifespan over the years, what's most important to note is that Nickelodeon Germany is officially here to stay, and permanently this time. To this day, Nickelodeon Germany still remains as one of the many international localizations of the First Kids network as it continues to air dubs of original and acquired programming since its 2005 relaunch. Alongside different subfeeds of Nick aimed at German-speaking viewers in Austria and Switzerland, the former of whom ceasing operations by the end of 2025. Rip and Pingus, I guess. At some point in 2024, however, there were plans for RTL Group to acquire the broadcasting rights of Nickelodeon Germany since Paramount, the current parent company of all Nick-related branding, was shifting focus towards the readily available content on their streaming services. But on September 17th of that year, Germany's Federal Cartel Office rejected the idea of bringing this merger to life. Honestly, in a modern age where a corporate merger is the equivalent to that of the Grim Reaper, especially with how the Ellison family behaves anytime Warner Brothers rejected the offer of merging with Paramount, I'm honestly glad this didn't happen. Play me out, Blümchen!
So, erstmal 1996 und ihr seid bei den Nickelodeon Gala live dabei, yeah! Und ich möchte, dass ihr uns begrüßt mit einer riesengroßen Welle! Hey! Super! Und alle haben die Hände oben!
Of all the international localizations of the First Kids network that came and went over the years, I personally consider Nickelodeon Germany to be the most interesting of the bunch, with how it almost came to an end before being revived as a result of Nick's programming finding a new home on a different channel. Had it not been for the deal they struck with RTL Group, Nickelodeon Germany would have easily fallen into obscurity. If there is anything to learn from this historical evolution of this particular localization of one of the biggest children's networks to ever walk the earth, just because that experiment you made happens to fail for one way or another, doesn't mean you're unable to give it another try, as long as you carefully analyze the mistakes you've made from the beginning so that you have a better chance of learning from them as you attempt to try again. The more you practice, the more you improve, and that's basically how I'd best summarize Nickelodeon Germany from then to now. An experiment that had its fair share of problems when it originally launched before shutting down, only for Nick's parent company to give it another chance after letting a different network own the broadcasting rights to Nick's original programming, leading to the version of Nickelodeon Germany that many have come to know of to this day. Who knows what Nickelodeon Germany's future will bring in the next few years, as long as their channel slots don't get taken over again. Fingers crossed.